Let's jump right into this Q&A episode. I haven't done one of these in a while. These are always some of my favorite episodes because I know I'm addressing what you want to hear and what you have questions with. So let's get right into it. Question number one. And keep in mind, I get a ton of questions submitted when people enter my Facebook group, my free Facebook group, which is called Fast to Heal Nutrition Support. You can always search that and join it. So I get lots of questions submitted there when people come in to that group. I always ask them what's their biggest struggle, what do they, what questions do they want answered. So a lot of these I grab from there. Some I grab from Instagram. I mean, all day long, I'm getting questions and comments and all kinds of messages in my direct messages, which I love. That's how I connect with all of you. So some of them are pulled from there. Some are pulled from my free masterclass, because as you listen to my free masterclass, you can ask questions along the way. And even though I might not always be able to answer them while you're in the masterclass and while you're watching the masterclass, I get email alerts that you have asked questions, and I always get back to you through there. So I have taken questions from a number of areas, and I've tried to, of course, look at the lists of questions and look at the ones that maybe I haven't addressed yet, or I get over and over and over. And I know that there's a lot of people asking the same question. So that's where I am grabbing all of these questions and all of those resources that I mentioned, where I'm getting questions from. Of course, you can access my free webinar, free masterclass, whatever you want to call it, is linked in the show notes. The free Facebook group is linked in the show notes. You can join that at any time and start asking questions. And then, of course, you can DM me on Instagram. And my Instagram handle, if you don't follow me there, I would highly encourage you that you do, because I am always posting what I'm eating, what I'm doing, suggestions, questions, polls. I'm asking you guys what you need, what you're doing, what you have questions with. So make sure you follow me on Instagram. And that's just shanna.husson.rdn. Okay, so question number one. When should you see results from intermittent fasting? I have fasted 20 hours with a 4-hour eating window for a week, and I've only lost 1 pound. Okay, so this sounds like somebody who is kind of brand new to the fasting world and starting to implement what I teach, and they're 1 week in. So 1 week, great. I am very proud of you for sticking with it for even that long, because sometimes people, 20 hours of fasting, if this is your first week at it, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, I didn't hop into 20 hours of fasting for several weeks along into my intermittent fasting journey. So everybody's going to see weight loss at different paces. This is what I want you to remember. I don't want you to go into this lifestyle with weight loss as your primary goal at all times. Like, oh, if I'm not seeing weight loss, I'm just going to give up. And I've only lost 1 pound this week. So this, I'm done with this. No, like, you want to go into this looking at it as a therapy to reverse your long-standing obesity, long-standing weight issues, long-standing insulin resistance, long-standing disease processes. You're undoing all the damage that you've done to your body for probably years or decades. So for you to be 1 week into a process and lose 1 pound, I think is phenomenal. There are people who have been at this for months before they see much weight loss, because there is a lot of healing that needs to go on inside with hormones, with whatever damage you've done to your body long term that needs to be healed before your body starts to lose weight. And I know we recently had a toxin expert on as well, or actually, I think she's coming up next week. But we talk about how we store toxins in our body fat. That's the safest place for your body to put toxins. So your body knows best. Like, if it's starts unleashing all of this stored body fat, a lot of toxins might come with it. So be patient and trust the process. Some people see results right away. I just had a message that I shared on Instagram this week about a gal who's like, I'm 7 days into your process. I've lost 5 pounds. I'm feeling better. Everything's great. But keep in mind, 5 pounds in a week, a lot of that's going to be water weight, right? So when we bring our insulin levels down over time, especially initially, there's a lot of flushing that happens with that. Your insulin levels are coming down. You're flushing out extra carbohydrate. Carbohydrate has water attached to it. You're bringing your insulin down. You just have a lot of extra water that's being flushed out in the process your body's been hanging on to with carbohydrate storage. So that's not always going to, you're not going to continue to lose 5 pounds a week. That would not be healthy. That would not be body fat. You can only lose about half of a pound of body fat a day if you fasted all day long. That's about what your body would burn off in order to meet its metabolic processes and to meet its energy needs. So everybody is different. There is no good timeline here. There's not like, oh, if you don't lose 10 pounds in the first 6 weeks, you're a failure. Absolutely not. You need to look at this as getting your body healthy with therapies that do so. Okay. Like we're not doing this just for weight loss. We're not, we're not fasting for days on end just to lose weight. We are fasting to bring insulin levels down and to allow our bodies to heal, because when we are in a fasted state, we can ramp up autophagy. We can give our digestive system a rest. Your body can perform all these tasks that it wouldn't be able to if it was busy digesting food. So when you're eating all day long, your body doesn't get a break. It's like having to produce enzymes and, break down food and all of these processes that go along with digestion, getting that food to where it needs to go. So when you're fasting, you're healing. So again, to lose a pound in a week, I think is phenomenal. And a lot of people, half a pound to a pound a week is pretty average for most people when they're doing this lifestyle. And keep in mind, weight loss is not always linear. You're not always going to like gain or lose 1 pound every single week. No, sometimes you're going to lose 2 pounds. Sometimes you're going to gain a half a pound. Sometimes you're going to lose half a pound. You might go up another pound and then lose 3 pounds. Like it's just, I wouldn't make your weight your primary target to whether or not this program and these methods and these strategies that I teach are successful for you. That's why I encourage people to get metabolic testing done and to see where they're at when they start this lifestyle and to see how metabolically healthy they are. Get your blood pressure checked, get your cholesterol panel checked, get your CRP checked, which is inflammation all over the body. And then monitor your progress every 3 to 6 months. And those who only stick with this lifestyle for a couple of weeks are probably not going to reap much benefit from it. But if you stick with this long term, it takes a while to reverse insulin resistance in severe cases. I'm still working at it. And I don't talk about my own insulin resistance all that often because I was in denial that I even had insulin resistance. Last summer, my insulin levels were at 10 and I thought it was a fluke or a mistake. And then 6 months later, they were at 7.5. So I was getting really, really, really close to healthy levels. But that's after I was intermittent fasting and, using carb restriction for 2 years. So I have no idea where I started with fasting insulin. I wish I did. I wish I knew to do the testing right when I started this whole process, but I'm willing to bet I was pretty insulin resistant. And now, I've been doing intermittent fasting and low carb eating for, very regularly for about 4 years, started dabbling in it about 5 years ago. So it takes a while. And I don't want to discourage anybody from, saying, oh my gosh, this is going to take me years, but it's a process. It took you years to months to years to decades to get to where you are now with your insulin levels. And it takes some time to reverse it. So don't give up and know that, your body heals differently than the next person. And in order for you to lose weight, you have to get your hormones balanced. You have to heal your body inside so that your body will just lose, like, it will start to regulate its weight then. Okay. So it's, you have to get the body ready. You have to do all these steps, and then your body will just regulate its weight on its own. Okay. So go about this process with the mindset you're doing a therapy and you're not just in it to lose weight. All right. Number 2, how can I measure my carb intolerance? So this is an interesting question, because at first I'm like, well, what is that question? And I'm like, you know what? Carb intolerance is basically just insulin resistance. So some people might call it carb intolerance and some people call it insulin resistance. You know, it's basically the same thing. So it's when your body is not utilizing carbohydrates for fuel well, right? And that is what we can call insulin resistance. So when you have carb intolerance, you get a fatty liver, you get prediabetes, you develop type 2 diabetes. If you don't reverse it, you may develop polycystic ovarian syndrome. You might get high blood pressure. You might get a really wonky lipid and cholesterol profile. So how can you measure it? I would measure it the same way I would have you go about measuring insulin resistance. So the 3 lab tests that I say will give you a definitive answer and a definitive number as to where your insulin resistance severity is would be fasting glucose, fasting insulin, which is not a glucose marker. It's a hormone marker, and hemoglobin A1C. Those are the baseline labs that I would have you get: fasting glucose, fasting insulin, hemoglobin A1C. With the fasting glucose and the fasting insulin, you can calculate your insulin resistant severity and how carb intolerant you are. And then I like to see the hemoglobin A1C for trends. So those are the 3 that I would ask you to get for sure. And then I would also encourage you to get the CRP, or C-reactive protein, because that kind of gives you your overall inflammation in your body. It doesn't tell you exactly where your inflammation is, but it'll give you how elevated the inflammation is in your body. And folks with insulin resistance usually have pretty high CRPs, or they can. So get that done, and then get a complete lipid profile done so I can see your triglycerides, especially, and your LDL cholesterol, get a blood pressure. And yeah, those are the main things that are going to give you indication of where your carb intolerance is. So depending on your severity of where your labs are and your symptoms, like how many physical symptoms do you have? Are you hungry all the time? Do you get shaky up, if you don't eat? Do you have to eat every couple of hours? Do you have severe sugar cravings? Do you have a lot of abdominal obesity or a lot of abdominal fat? Do you have long-standing obesity? Do you have blood sugar dysregulation? Do you have high blood pressure? Those are all indications that you have insulin resistance and severe insulin resistance. So depending on the severity of your insulin resistance or your carb intolerance, then I can help you to say, okay, this is the level of carbohydrates we should be starting at. And you might not always stay there. I mean, you might, have your carbohydrate level a pretty low level for a while, just so you can be in a ketogenic state to heal your body. And then you can add more carbohydrates later. And I do have a carb quiz that will help you decipher where to start. So you can go to fasttoheal.info/carb quiz. And that is linked in the show notes as well. But everybody's kind of starting at a different point depending on your level of severity. And then you can ask for repeat testing every 3 to 6 months for those same markers that I talked about, to see how you're progressing. And when you sign up with me in any of my courses, or if you order a personalized protocol from me, I give you a link for optional metabolic testing. So you can get just your fasting insulin tested, which even that in and of itself tells me a lot, or you can get a complete metabolic profile, and I have home kits that I send to you. You can ask your own provider. That is perfectly acceptable. And a lot of times these tests are covered by your insurance. Or if sometimes your provider is just not going to get that fasting insulin for you because they don't know what it is or how to run it. It's not expensive. It's a cheap test. It's like $5 to $20 typically. So it's not expensive, but they just don't know how to interpret it, or people aren't asking for it, so they don't run it for you. So those are the tests that I would suggest, and they are inside all of my courses. And of course, Low Insulin Academy is where I teach you how to reverse your carb intolerance or reverse your insulin resistance. And that you can enroll in the on-demand version at any time. And then the next live version that I have will be early September, and that I provide group coaching along with all of the lessons that you learn. So those links are in the show notes to sign up for those courses as well. But that is how you would go about finding your carb intolerance. And then of course, my masterclass walks through all of these tests and all of the tests that I just recommended that you get. It goes through all the testing and it shows you how to interpret all the tests. So if you have these tests at home, you can watch my masterclass and it tells you exactly how to take all of these tests and calculate your insulin resistance severity. So the show note, the masterclass link is in the show notes if you haven't registered for that before. And then in the masterclass, I also show you how to start reversing that insulin resistance, but it's a process, as I've said. So that is how you can measure your carb intolerance, but it's really important. I always encourage my students to get a baseline of where they're at now, because I didn't do that because I didn't know how, 4 or 5 years ago when I started this process. I've only recently, it hasn't even been a year since I've been measuring my fasting insulin. None of my other markers were ever elevated. I never had any elevated glucose or my cholesterol was slightly elevated, but the breakdown was good. The ratio was good. And I never had any kind of elevated hemoglobin A1C, but my insulin was high. So that was the very, very start of progressing to blood sugar dysregulation. So those are the tests that I would recommend. And like I said, I can help you get those inside any of my courses, and you can watch the masterclass for further breakdown for those. Number 3, if high insulin, I love this question, actually. I love it. Like when somebody posted this on my Instagram account in my DMs the other day. Oh no, I think it was in my masterclass. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love this question and I love addressing it because it makes no sense. Okay, so number 3 is, if high insulin is my issue, why am I injecting more insulin? Oh my gosh, what a great question. Okay, so it makes no sense, right? And once I started to really understand insulin resistance and how it drives prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, it's really criminal that we treat, I shouldn't say we, because I don't treat it this way, but the conventional system treats type 2 diabetes with medications and then insulin. Right? Because more insulin is just going to make you more insulin resistant. Oh my goodness, it's so backward. So this is a great question because it makes no sense. If I'm insulin resistant, why am I injecting insulin to treat my diabetes? So the conventional system basically just says, dose your insulin for your carb intake. So go ahead and eat 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrate like most Americans do, and just dose more insulin for it if you need to. It's so crazy. So of course we should not be treating diabetes with insulin. Type 2, please go back. Type 2 diabetes, we should not be treating with insulin. Type 1, yes. Type 1 is different. Type 1, you need to inject insulin or you will die. So we definitely need it with the type 1, but type 2, we should not be increasing insulin to manage type 2 diabetes. What we should be doing is working on bringing the insulin levels down. rather than keep dosing more insulin. So what we do is all the strategies that I teach. We teach therapeutic carb restriction because carbohydrates, ultra processed carbohydrates especially, drive insulin levels up. So when we tell a diabetic, eat 5 to 6 times a day and just make sure you're injecting your long acting insulin, your short acting insulin, your insulin before bed, like that is not how we should be treating insulin or diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Okay, we should be saying, okay, let's restrict your carbohydrates because that's what's driving insulin levels up. Let's stop eating all the time and feed you in a way where your blood sugar is not going to rise so steeply and you won't be secreting so much insulin. Okay, that is how we treat type 2 diabetes. So we restrict carbohydrates. It's a necessary therapy if you're pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetes. Okay, it's not like, oh, Shanna's just mean and she's telling me I can't have all these processed foods and I have to keep my carbohydrates under 50. Well, if you want to heal your diabetes, your type 2 diabetes, that's what you need to do. You need to restrict your carbohydrates so you don't get a big spike of insulin because insulin will keep driving the disease process. So we need to take away the factors that are driving the insulin up in the first place. So we reduce our carbohydrate intake. And for my diabetic friends, my type 2 diabetic friends, and actually anybody with long-standing disease process, type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, PCOS, fatty liver, 25 to 50 grams of carbohydrate daily is what I suggest for you. And then we implement intermittent fasting. Why? Because we're not eating as often. We don't spike our insulin as much. And then we throw in the food order and eating in a proper, eating certain foods first when we eat our meals. Fiber first, then our protein or fats, and then any starches or sugar so that we don't stimulate that insulin. Okay, so we are treating type 2 diabetes exactly the opposite. And that's what makes me so steamed. It's like, this is a reversible disease, but people just keep taking more and more insulin because they think that's what they need to do. And this is the problem. It's like the more insulin you take, the more insulin resistant you become, the more weight you gain. It's like how many type 2 diabetics, once they went on insulin, they had even the hardest time trying to lose weight, right? It's like, okay, well, my blood sugars are better managed now. I had to go from taking metformin and maybe some other type 2 diabetes medications. I'm to the point where I need insulin. Okay, my blood sugars have come down because now my body's stuffing more energy into my cells, forcing it with the insulin, stuffing it away into wherever it can stuff it. But I'm not losing weight and I just keep getting sicker and requiring more insulin. Like that's the opposite of what we should be doing. So we need to lower the insulin to actually reverse the disease. So it makes no sense. It makes no sense why we are treating type 2 diabetes with more and more insulin when you get to that point. Now, I do want to say a little bit about type 1 diabetes, because I'm sure there's listeners here and I've had that question submitted a lot too. Like, do you treat type 1 the same that you would type 2? Yes, I do. Now, type 1 is different because you have to have insulin, right? Like you can't get away from not taking any insulin. But you can certainly reduce the amount of insulin that you need by following the same lifestyle. So if we can reduce your carbohydrate intake, maybe you're doing 200 to 300 carbohydrates right now, and we reduce you down to 50, you're not going to require as much insulin. Your body, you can increase your protein and your fat intake, and your body will learn to burn ketones for fuel. Just because you're type 1 diabetic and you don't have insulin there to get, the glucose into your cells doesn't mean you can't metabolize ketones. That's a separate process. So you can absolutely use ketones for energy when you're type 1 diabetic. And I know lots of type 1 diabetics who eat hardly any carbohydrate and fuel primarily on fat, and they hardly need to take any insulin. Okay, so if they follow a ketogenic diet and they don't eat that often, they follow these same approaches, not that everybody has to be in the ketogenic state, but You do the same thing and you just don't need as much insulin. And there's many type 1 diabetics who grow insulin resistant, which is kind of crazy because you're not able to produce insulin on your own, right? And you have to dose it, but you're dosing it so high in response to the carbohydrates that you're taking in that you grow insulin resistant. So here we can have type 1 diabetics with insulin resistance. It's pretty crazy. So I would do the same thing for type 1 diabetics. And I worked with plenty of type 1 diabetics. They just reduce their carbohydrate intake. They stop eating as often, and pretty soon they don't need as much insulin. Okay, so that was a great question. And finally, the last question is, will my menopausal symptoms improve with this lifestyle? So will my menopausal symptoms improve with this lifestyle? I can't make you any promises. And like most of the questions in this that I ever have to address with nutrition and lifestyle and weight loss and reversing disease, it's a gray area. It's not going to be the same exact answer for every single person. So I'm not going to say, yes, your symptoms are going to improve for sure. Most likely they are. I can say that. Most likely that they are going to improve, because anytime you have insulin resistance and you fix the insulin resistance, all of your hormones talk to each other much better. We have a huge hormonal network that is interdependent on other hormones and their signals and how they're talking to each other. So if we have a huge problem with insulin and insulin being high all the dang time, we're going to mess up our glucagon. We're going to mess up our sex hormones. We're going to mess up our cortisol. Like, everything is affected. There are insulin receptors on every cell in your body. So if those are messed up, the signaling for your entire body is messed up. So if you fix the insulin resistance, you can start to fix that entire hormonal network. And I have so many people who say, yeah, actually, when you're through menopause, it's easier to adapt this lifestyle of intermittent fasting, not eating as often, eating lower carbohydrate, because your hormones aren't fluctuating anymore. Those of us who are still having our menstrual cycle in the perimenopausal phase, which is the worst phase to be in, because you don't know if you're still getting your cycle or not, or maybe you're getting it sometimes and you're not, and it's kind of a guessing game. But once you're through menopause, which officially is no menstrual period for at least 12 months, then your hormones aren't fluctuating any longer, right? So we don't have those rises in estrogen and progesterone. Like, they're a lot more stable. And that can bring a whole host of issues, like, this person's probably referring to. You can have hot flashes, you can have weight gain, you can have, hormonal shifts, you can have, belly fat deposition, you can have, all kinds of things can start kind of happening in menopause. But I will say this too, when you are through perimenopause and into your menopausal years, you are not as insulin sensitive. I want to repeat that. You're not as insulin sensitive. So you're more likely to be insulin resistant because of it has a lot to do with the estrogen falling, and those estrogen receptors. It all plays together. So my point being, women do very, very well with this lifestyle as they go through menopause, because they're not as insulin sensitive anymore. So bringing the carbohydrate levels down can be very helpful, can help you manage symptoms. And then, just not having to eat as often, it can help regulate that fall in hormonal, in those hormones. So is it going to fix everything? I don't know. I've had some women say, yeah, like, I was starting perimenopause and menopausal symptoms and I started this lifestyle and now they're gone. Like, I feel so much better. And then there's going to be other people who maybe need to get their estrogen checked, their progesterone checked, their testosterone checked, and maybe they need some kind of hormonal replacement therapy, or hormone replenishment therapy is what I like to call it. And I've had lots of experts on the podcast talking about that in past episodes that you can look for. But a lot of times, people's symptoms do improve. And of course, this lifestyle is a great therapy and treatment for PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome, because that's basically diabetes of the ovary. So this whole lifestyle is treatment for PCOS because insulin resistance is driving that disease state as well. So the insulin resistance in the ovary is going to increase testosterone and all the male androgens. And that's where all of those symptoms of PCOS come from. And then your progesterone levels fall, and then you don't ovulate. So you don't get your period, you have facial hair. All of these symptoms are all hormonal imbalances driven by insulin resistance. So if you can fix that, and I'm not going to say PCOS is multifactorial, a lot of things that come into play. But if you can fix insulin resistance, you can at least start and get a good grasp on those symptoms and bring your fertility back. And PCOS is the leading cause of infertility. And so it's a huge problem, and it's driven by, our really crappy food system, and eating too much, eating too often, eating too many high carb, high sugar foods. And just living the standard American lifestyle with the standard American diet. So will your menopausal symptoms improve? Probably. I would say almost always. But I can't say for certain, because if something else is driving those symptoms, then of course you may need to look into some further therapies. So that is it for this episode. I love to do these Q&As. So keep writing in with your questions. If you have them, you can submit them to me through DM on Instagram. You can submit them through email. Just send them to shanna@fasttoheal.info. You can submit them through my free masterclass. There's a place to write your questions in there. There's lots of ways that you can ask your questions, and I'll be doing another Q&A episode in a couple of weeks. So that's it for now. Bye for now. I'll see you back next week for another episode.